Barku, a breath to spark the human heart. G'day there, friends and family, and welcome to this episode of the Barku podcast. It's been a little while since I made one of these. I think the last one was at the end of last year with friend Michael Cordner, talking about his youth program called Land the Jab, which was a lot of fun to have a chat about, and I hope if that's something you're interested in, that you've gone and checked that out. Today is just me talking to myself, a little bit of a monologue, which is usually the format for these podcasts. But I had a bit of time away from it because I went back on a little loop. See, I've got a tendency to loop back on things. I think we all have a tendency at times to loop back on things in terms of where we spend our time and energy. And today I want to share a way to think about these loops in the hope that my experience and this way of thinking about it may help to set you free from some of those loops if that's something that's of interest to you. A little bit of a reference point, a mirror to help you reflect on what's been happening in your own journey of life. And to do that, I want to talk about jigsaw puzzles, because who doesn't love doing a good jigsaw puzzle? When we're little kids, people give us jigsaw puzzles. I remember having one of my name, M-A-R-K, a very simple puzzle where the pieces had simply been cut out of a piece of timber, and the challenge was to fit each letter into the correct space. These are great for developing spatial awareness, and they give us a real sense of satisfaction when each of those pieces falls into place and we're able to complete the picture. As kids, we get puzzled with things like Old MacDonald's farm or a tractor or a car or an animal, something like that, and we put those pieces together and they tend to be quite simple, but to our small minds, that's about all we can handle, and we get a real sense of joy and satisfaction from seeing what was whole becoming fragmented and then becoming whole again and joined. We love completing those pictures. And if you've ever been away on perhaps a weekend or a holiday with a couple of friends, and there's somebody in your group of friends who loves a good puzzle, that person tends to bring something ridiculous like a picture of a grass field or an empty ocean, something with no real reference points, perhaps a starry night sky. And they spread the pieces out on the living room table so that nobody can eat around that table for the period of your holiday. And over the course of the next few days or week or however long it tends to be, that puzzle gradually begins to piece together. People don't sit down and solve it all at once. You could, but the way I've observed this happens is people tend to loop back to the table. They have a look at the pieces, they shuffle them around, they sort a few out. They take a minute to take it all in, then they go off and they do something else, come back, a few bits click in together, then they wander off and then they loop back and they wander off and they loop back. And I thought, this is how I've approached my entire career. I come to the table, I piece a few bits together, and then I walk away and I loop back. I've done this about 6 or 7 times over the last 17 years. I've worked in 5 different schools, a church, and a youth re-engagement program for Year 9 students. And each job would last about 2 to 3 years before I had a sense that it was time to move along, that my work there was done. Now, in the beginning when I was young, it was easy enough to listen to this voice, to think, okay, my contribution here is done. I think I've brought to this community what I had to serve and to do here. I've learnt what I could learn. And now it's time to cut ties, to move, to grow. It's a bit like growing out of a favourite pair of shoes as a kid. That pair of shoes, which was fantastic when you were 7 years old, gets a little bit tight and constricting by the time you're 9 or 10. And it's not good for your foot or the shoes if you keep trying to squeeze into them. Now, initially, it was easy to walk away from these positions, these roles, when the time was right. However, life has a way as we get older of creating more responsibilities, or at least more perceived responsibilities. So I got married, we had a dog, we got a mortgage, and we had a kid. And with each of these developments in life, I started to adopt the idea that security and stability were really important. And when that little voice told me it was time to move on from some roles that I'd been working in, even though I could sense it, I was really reluctant to let go. And I tried to hold on. And each time I tried to hold on, that's when the troubles seemed to occur. See, nature doesn't really allow for stagnation and comfort, at least not for too long. See, nature teaches us that if something stagnates, if it stopped growing, then it's actually dying. Nature says we either grow and expand and we continue to flourish, or we simply die. And eventually, when I refused to let go of a couple of positions recently, my body started to manifest the disease and restlessness of my spirit. Because when we don't listen to the gentle nudges of the wisdom of our bodies, then the body has different ways of speaking up that can be quite uncomfortable. Now, fortunately for me, rather than fight it, I have let go of my last job, which ended only a few months ago, and it was a good job, had a lot of good things going for it. I did like being there to a point. However, once a bunch of skin infections and a sinus infection started to manifest again, I knew it was time to let go. Now, previously, this pattern, I'd get a job, it'd be good for a period of time, I'd get the sense that it was time to move on, I'd perhaps ignore this sense that it was time to move on, an illness would ensue, forcing me to step away from that position. And then each time I withdrew from these school-based roles, I'd find myself drawn to physical work. Work like gardening or labouring for a builder, painting, working with carpenters. And this physical work had a really beneficial therapeutic effect. Being outdoors, moving my body seemed to really help me repair and rest my body, rest my mind in particular, to the point where I'd start to feel good. And then inevitably I'd start, or I'd be approached to come back and do some more youth work in a school. And here's where the puzzle comes into play. See, because while this pattern kind of worked, I had a sense that I was ignoring some important pieces of the puzzle that were happening in my life. While I could feel good enough after doing a season of physical work, it still wasn't addressing the underlying problems in the type of work or the types of environments I was choosing to do my work. And I had some deeper reflection and puzzling to do to work through this. Now, we've all heard the mental health analogies that fly around about fear and anxiety. You know, it's pretty common to hear people talk about how these emotions were relevant back in time, back in the caveman times when we lived in jungles and we had to be wary of tigers and predators or warring tribes that were coming to get us. And we're told now that these emotions are almost nuisances because we live in relatively safe places, and the problems that we face at work or in our relationships at home, they're not actually life-threatening, even though our body and our stress responds as if they were. So conventionally, we use a bunch of talk therapies or sometimes drugs to turn off these undesired emotions so that we can get along with our lives. And this is effectively kind of what I've been trying to do until I had the realization that perhaps these illnesses, perhaps the discomfort, the dis-ease that was surfacing was actually trying to communicate something else. And instead of trying to rationalize these fears and anxieties away, instead of trying to to separate myself from the illnesses and treat them as something medicalized that was outside of my control, what would happen if I trusted the wisdom of my body and I started to pay attention to these signals and treated them with curiosity and wonder, like pieces of a puzzle? Even if those pieces were a little painful to sit with at times, perhaps inconvenient or undesirable, I started to get a sense that every illness, every injury, every emotional breakdown is actually pieces of the puzzle or pieces of ourselves that are calling for our attention. They're saying something here is out of place. Pay some attention. See how this can fit back together to make this whole again. Over life, we have a tendency to give away these pieces of who we are. Initially, it's to fit in with our families of origin, because parents, we can't help but project some of our expectations onto our kids, despite them not being us. We have our own fears, our own conditioning, our own stories about what makes a happy life. And we tend to project that onto our kids. And as kids, we adopt these external narratives about the importance of things like subjects at school, or particular relationships, or particular jobs, what is and isn't acceptable in our social groups. And in order to make them fit, sometimes it means disowning a part of ourselves. I remember as a kid sometimes sitting with a puzzle that was getting a bit tricky and just trying to make some pieces fit together just for the satisfaction of them fitting together, even though they weren't right. Because in reality, in a jigsaw puzzle, every piece only has one place. You can't force two bits together that don't belong together. Even if they're a close enough fit, if you start sanding corners off pieces, or you start chipping away at them, then you might get a near enough fit, but the whole picture then will remain incomplete forever. Thing is, these fractures, these pieces that we go to when we've been trying to push our own will or our own desires or somebody else's story along in our lives, can be quite painful. And there's temptation to avoid these feelings, to numb it out with food or alcohol or distractions. There's a temptation to rationalize these things away as if they're outside of our control. But what I discovered and what came to my hand at just the right time was another way to approach these puzzles that is not so difficult, that doesn't cost us a whole lot of willpower or energy, because healing's a natural process. I mean, you look at what happens when you knock a part of your body, you might graze yourself, you might fall over, you might nick your finger. The body has a way of healing itself. It doesn't need us to think through what needs to happen, how the blood needs to congeal, how the cells need to rejuvenate, or the skin needs to repair itself. That all happens unconsciously. So the process I discovered that I'd like to share with you today that can really help, I think it'd actually help for solving a jigsaw puzzle if that's something you're interested in doing. But certainly something I've found helpful for beginning to solve some of the puzzles about who I am or the essence of what I'm doing here. And that is this book called Drawing on the Artist Within by Betty Edwards. Now, this was published back in 1986, which is nearly as old as I am. It's actually my father-in-law's book, and it sat on my shelf for years before I opened it. But I had a sense at this time, after finishing my last job, that this book contained something that I needed. So I went and picked it up. And lo and behold, Betty takes you through how to draw. But alongside that, she also teaches a creative problem-solving process consisting of 3 simple steps. The first step is saturation. That's where we gather all the information. Now, if this is a puzzle, it's where we spread the pieces out on the table so that we can see them all clearly. And we pick up each piece and we turn it over in our hands. We look at it from some different angles. We pay attention to the light and shade, the color, the shapes that are contained within each piece. And after we've spent some time with those pieces, we start to label them with the left side of our brain. So this is all right side of the brain. So right side of the brain, we draw pictures. We define a boundary, a bit like finding the straight edges of a puzzle, because that defines the problem where we're asking our subconscious brain to solve. And then we simply allow ourselves to draw. We get the sense of a feeling of the problem that we've been experiencing, and we put pencil to paper without drawing any distinguishable symbols, shapes, pictures, and we simply draw what we feel. Now, this is a novel concept because it means letting go of logical control, something that is not really popular in our culture, but I think is the heart of all creativity. And Betty talks about then understanding that there's a subconscious language in the way we express ourselves through the marks that we make on the page, just as there is in the way that we sing or the way that we play a musical instrument. There's something beyond the shapes. There's the speed, the intensity, the thickness, the weight of our lines that conveys meaning from within, and a meaning that we don't tend to or can't consciously or logically completely grasp. So the first stage is simply to draw out the problem and then to explore the parts of the problem by redrawing and redrawing again over a period of a couple of days. And then Betty suggests you simply let all that information commit into your subconscious brain. So it's come from the subconscious. We've made it visible. We've articulated what we see there and described it. And then we've just let it all seep back in. However, this time, as we move to the second stage of the process, we set the intention. We say to our subconscious brain, look, this is a problem I've been experiencing and I'd like you to help me solve it. So when you're ready, if you could present me with a few solutions. And this Betty calls the incubation period, where we may look at the problem from time to time just to jog our subconscious memory of what that problem looks like. And then we allow that information to integrate back into our being. We absorb all of the information into our body, and then we release it to the unconscious brain, to divinity, to the universe, to allow those pieces to float around in that space inside us. And the brain picks up the pieces, turns them around, and over time it pieces them together. And eventually we move to step 3, which is the exciting part that Betty describes as the illumination. Now, the illumination is when spontaneously, from somewhere in your subconscious, you start to get some answers to the problem that you've been focusing on. For me, this started with a little trip down to Bells Beach where I made a date with my subconscious brain. I said, look, when I get down to the boardwalk there at Bells, I'd love to start to get some resolution to this problem of my career and why it hasn't been working out over the last 17 years. So I rode my bike down to Bells Beach, and as I stood up on the boardwalk and looked out to sea, it was a beautiful, clear day. There was a handful of surfers out in the water, and there weren't too many waves, or at least not initially when I looked at the water. However, over time, I realised there was quite a large swell. In fact, it was so big that it was nearly closing out across the bay. It was just a matter of being a long period swell, where the energy in the water, it was there, but there were long lulls, long periods of rest in between each pulse in the ocean. Not exactly the revelation that I was hoping for, but helpful nonetheless in terms of understanding how my energy works in work environments. So while I've loved my time in schools, my contributions were valued, I was recognised, rewarded, I've discovered that the pieces of what I do for work need some rearranging. What is the next expression of that work? Well, I'm not 100% sure. looking back at the podcast, I realized that mid last year, I had this idea to do a little project called 11-11-22, where by the 11th of the 11th in 2022, I would have produced 11 pieces of art, visual art, and 11 songs to share with some friends. However, I got scared. I looped back on myself and I took another job, and all my energy and creativity was dissipated in other areas. So perhaps there's something there for me to explore. I've also been completing some meditation teacher training, which has again been incredibly enlightening in terms of further understanding who I am and how we work, how we integrate our being with who we are and the environment, the world around us, and how we integrate with divinity in the universe. And I'll be facilitating some Sunday morning sessions. So if you live in Torquay, you can hit me up and join us there. Jed and I have also started another little podcast where we create stories using 3 words, which is super fun. And I'm also working for a crew called Good Times Adventures, where I take young people out on e-mountain bikes. So young fellas either through Child and Family Services or through the NDIS who need some sort of outdoor therapeutic experience and mentoring. And at the moment, that's me. So I hope that the idea of the puzzle perhaps holds some sort of value for you. Perhaps as you think about problems that you may be mulling around, perhaps giving your subconscious brain a chance to go through the process of solving some problems for you without you having to do the hard work. If that sounds appealing to you, try to get a hold of Betty Edwards' book, or even just from this podcast, have a go at just those 3-step process of saturation, incubation, and illumination, and see what presents itself. Because as much as I'd like to think the contrary is true, we're not really in control of everything that happens in our lives, especially important things. And when we try to, my experience is the pieces just won't fit together. We get sick. We experience a whole lot of resistance and dis-ease in life. And perhaps there is a better way. If you'd like to be on the podcast, if you've got a story to tell so that I don't have to sit here talking to myself, I'd love to hear from you. There's an email address in the show notes below. This will be on YouTube too. I've added another level of difficulty by switching a camera on and pointing it at my face here, which is a strange experience. So if you'd like to make a video podcast, hit me up. Love to have you on. If you've got a story to tell, it can be any story. Perhaps you haven't had the call up from Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan yet, and you want to get in some practice, then you are more than welcome to be on the Barku podcast. So until we chat again next time, I wish you well. I hope you have a great week. Barku.